Chen's hands trembled slightly as she balanced the bamboo steamer against her hip, fishing for her keys in the growing October dusk. The warm containers held 6 months of experimentation: guabao sliders with slow-braised pork belly, the 5-spice blend exactly as Nai had taught her, but elevated with a Michigan apple slaw that bridged her grandmother's Taiwanese heritage with the local flavors she'd grown to love. Each bite represented a conversation between cultures, a story she'd been afraid to tell until tonight. The Maple Grove Neighborhood Association's annual potluck had become her personal Mount Everest. 5 years of living here. 5 years of polite nods and weather conversations. 5 years of feeling like a ghost haunting the edges of suburban belonging. David had encouraged her to bring something special this time, something that represented who she really was, not just another store-bought dessert or safe casserole that would disappear into the background of forgettable dinner table offerings. "You're an incredible cook," he'd said that morning, watching her fold the delicate bao dough with practiced precision. "These people don't know what they're missing." But Maya knew what they were missing. She'd seen it in their eyes during neighborhood barbecues, the polite but puzzled expressions when she mentioned her grandmother's restaurant in San Francisco, the way conversations shifted when she tried to contribute stories about growing up between two cultures. Grand Rapids had welcomed David's engineering expertise with open arms, but Maya felt like she was still waiting for her invitation to belong. The community center buzzed with familiar voices as she pushed through the glass doors. Long tables, draped in harvest-themed tablecloths, groaned under the weight of traditional Midwestern offerings: green bean casseroles topped with crispy onions, cream of mushroom-based everything, Jell-O salads that defied both gravity and good sense. Maya found a spot at the end of one table, carefully arranging her bamboo steamers and the small cards she'd written explaining each dish. Mrs. Eleanor Kowalski appeared at her elbow almost immediately, her sharp blue eyes studying the unfamiliar presentation with undisguised curiosity. At 78, the retired teacher had earned a reputation as the neighborhood's unofficial food critic, a woman who'd lived through rationing, casserole trends, and the slow evolution of Grand Rapids, from a furniture town to something more cosmopolitan. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. "Now this is interesting," Eleanor said, lifting the lid of one steamer. The aromatic steam that escaped carried notes of star anise, ginger, and something indefinably comforting. "What am I looking at here, dear?" Maya's voice found its footing. "Guabao, Taiwanese steamed buns. The pork is braised with 5-spice soy sauce and a touch of rock sugar. I added some local apple slaw for freshness." She watched Eleanor's face carefully, looking for signs of the polite disinterest she'd grown accustomed to. Instead, Eleanor's eyebrows rose with genuine intrigue. 5-spice. Haven't encountered that since my late husband worked at the Amway Grand. He was always bringing home stories from the kitchen there. She selected one of the pillowy buns and took a careful bite. Her eyes closed briefly, processing the layers of flavor: the rich, melting pork, the slight sweetness of the bun, the crisp contrast of apple and cilantro. "Oh my," Eleanor murmured. "This is something special." A small crowd began to gather, drawn by Eleanor's obvious approval and the unfamiliar but enticing aromas rising from Maya's corner of the table. The Patels from 3 houses down approached, cautiously, followed by the Johnsons and their teenage daughter. Maya found herself explaining the dishes with growing confidence, sharing stories about learning to cook at her grandmother's side, about the way certain spices could transport you across oceans and decades. The 5-spice represents the 5 elements in traditional Chinese philosophy, she explained to Janet Johnson, who was photographing the food with her phone. "My grandmother always said food should tell a story about where you come from and where you're going." For 20 minutes, Maya felt something she'd been chasing since moving to Michigan: the warm sensation of being seen, really seen, by her community. People were asking questions, taking second helpings, requesting the recipe for her grandmother's braising liquid. David appeared at her side, his smile proud and relieved as he watched his wife finally stepping into her element. Then, Richard Henderson's voice cut through the gentle murmur of conversation like a blade through silk. "What the hell is this supposed to be?" The question might have been innocent enough, curiosity from someone genuinely unfamiliar with the cuisine. But the tone carried something else entirely. Richard stood at the edge of the gathering crowd, his 6-foot frame imposing in a way that had served him well in insurance boardrooms and country club negotiations. His wife Susan hovered behind him, her expression already shifting into the apologetic half-smile she wore whenever her husband's opinions grew too large for the room. Maya felt the temperature shift around her table. The comfortable warmth of moments before evaporated as neighbors instinctively stepped back, creating space for whatever was about to unfold. "It's gua bao," Maya said, her voice steady despite the sudden hammering of her heart. "Taiwanese steamed buns with... It smells like a Chinese restaurant threw up on a perfectly good piece of bread," Richard interrupted, his voice carrying the particular authority of someone accustomed to being heard. "This is a neighborhood potluck, not some ethnic food festival." The silence that followed felt like a physical weight. Maya watched as the neighbors who'd been enthusiastically trying her food moments before suddenly found their shoes fascinating. Janet Johnson quietly slipped her phone back into her purse. The Patels melted toward the dessert table without making eye contact. Only Eleanor remained, her weathered hands gripping her small plate with white knuckles. "Richard, I think you're—" "No, Eleanor, I'm sorry, but someone needs to say it." Richard's voice grew louder, ensuring his words carried to every corner of the community center. "We come to these things expecting good, honest American food. Comfort food, not some disgusting ethnic slop that nobody can even pronounce." "Susan." Henderson's nervous laughter punctuated her husband's words like an exclamation point. The sound hit Maya like a physical blow, high, brittle, and completely lacking in conviction. It was the laugh of someone desperate to diffuse tension, but too weak to challenge its source. Maya felt something crumble inside her chest. The careful presentation, the handwritten cards, the hours spent folding each bun to perfection, all of it suddenly felt foolish, naive. The story she'd tried to tell through her food had been reduced to disgusting ethnic slop in front of everyone whose acceptance she'd been quietly seeking for 5 years. David stepped closer to his wife, his engineer's mind struggling to process the casual cruelty he'd just witnessed. "Maya's food is incredible," he said, his voice tight with anger. "Maybe if you actually tried it—" "I don't need to try it to know it doesn't belong here," Richard replied with finality. He gestured vaguely at the rest of the table. "Look around. Green bean casserole, tuna noodle, mac and cheese, food that makes sense, food that belongs." The weight of those 2 words, "belongs here," settled over Maya like a shroud. She looked around the room at faces she'd been greeting for 5 years, seeing them now through the lens of Richard's casual xenophobia. How many of them agreed with him? How many had been thinking the same thing but lacked his willingness to say it out loud? Mrs. Kowalski set down her plate with a sharp click that echoed in the renewed silence. "Richard Henderson, you're an ass," she said clearly. But her words felt hollow in the vast space Richard's cruelty had created. Maya began quietly packing, her steamers, her movements precise despite the tremor in her hands. She didn't look up as the room slowly returned to its previous murmur, conversations resuming at a careful distance from her corner of the table. She didn't acknowledge David's whispered questions, or Eleanor's outraged muttering about ignorant fools and wasted good food. She simply packed her untouched dishes, lifted her bamboo steamers, and walked toward the exit with the same dignified silence her grandmother had taught her to maintain in the face of ignorance. Behind her, she left more than just food on the table. She left the last remnants of her hope that Grand Rapids might someday feel like home. David followed her to the parking lot, his anger radiating like heat from a furnace. Maya, what he said, that wasn't about you or your food. That was about him being a small-minded piece of... It's fine, Maya said quietly, sliding the steamers into their car's back seat with mechanical precision. But it wasn't fine. It would never be fine. The words, disgusting ethnic slop, would replay in her mind for weeks, months maybe. They would echo every time she considered bringing a dish to share, every time she thought about opening herself up to this community again. As they drove home through the familiar streets of their neighborhood, Maya stared out the window at houses lit with warm yellow light. Inside those houses, families were probably finishing dinner, sharing stories about their days, belonging to each other, and to this place in ways that suddenly felt impossibly foreign to her. Richard Henderson had done more than insult her food. He'd reminded her that no matter how long she lived here, no matter how much she tried to bridge the gap between her heritage and her home, there would always be someone ready to tell her she didn't belong. That her story, told through 5 spice and star anise, through the patient folding of dough her grandmother had taught her, was unwelcome at their table. The hurt settled deep in her chest, transforming from sharp pain into something harder, more determined. She thought of Nai-Nai's stories about the early days of her restaurant, about the customers who'd walked out when they realized the cook was Chinese, about the persistence and excellence that had eventually won them over. Maybe it was time to stop trying to fit in. Maybe it was time to make them remember her name. The hurt settled deep in her chest, transforming from sharp pain into something harder, more determined. But that resolve lasted only until they pulled into their driveway. As Maya carried the untouched steamers into their kitchen, the weight felt like carrying her own failure. David hovered in the doorway, hands shoved deep in his pockets. Maya, what happened tonight? I know what happened tonight. Her voice came out sharper than intended. She set the steamers down with unnecessary force, bamboo clattering against granite. Richard Henderson made it very clear where I stand. And where were they when it mattered? Maya scraped untouched pork into containers with mechanical precision. When he called my food disgusting ethnic slop, where were all those impressed neighbors? The question hung unanswered because they both knew the truth. Fear was louder than appreciation, social pressure stronger than genuine connection. For 3 days, Maya avoided the kitchen entirely. She ordered chain restaurant takeout, picking at bland chicken while David watched with growing concern. The spice rack sat untouched. Even the smell of garlic from neighboring houses made her stomach clench with shame. On Wednesday evening, David tried coaxing her back. I picked up some of that 5 spice you like, he said, setting the jar on the counter like an offering. Maybe we could make those noodles? I'm not hungry, Maya lied, though her stomach growled. David's patience cracked. You can't stop cooking because of one ignorant asshole. Cooking is who you are. Maybe that's the problem. The words escaped bitter as burnt garlic. Maybe I've been trying too hard to hold on to something that doesn't belong here. That night, unable to sleep, Maya found herself scrolling through food blogs and restaurant reviews at 2 a.m. Grand Rapids had a surprisingly vibrant dining scene, places she'd never explored. Her cursor hovered over a review of Le Petit Jardin, a small French restaurant outside the city. Chef Laurent Dubois' commitment to classical French technique is uncompromising. This isn't fusion cuisine or comfort food. This is the work of a master craftsman who understands that excellence speaks louder than innovation. Maya read it 3 times, studying photos of dishes that looked like edible sculptures. Something about the chef's story resonated. A master who'd chosen isolation over compromise, excellence over accessibility. Around 4 a.m., she gave up on sleep and padded to the kitchen. Almost unconsciously, she pulled ingredients from the refrigerator: ginger, garlic, soy sauce, the 5 spice David had bought. Her hands moved through familiar motions of making congee, the rice porridge Nai fed her whenever she was sick or sad. As the rice broke down into creamy comfort, Maya felt something shift. The rhythm of stirring, the transformation of simple ingredients into something complex and nourishing. It reminded her why she'd fallen in love with cooking. When David found her at 6 a.m., she sat at the island with congee topped with crispy shallots and a soft-boiled egg. The kitchen smelled like home again. "Feeling better?" he asked carefully. "I called in sick to work. I need to think." Maya took another spoonful, tasting the complexity that came from patience and technique. "About what I want to do next. About whether I'm going to let Richard Henderson define what I'm capable of." She thought about Chef Dubois and his uncompromising pursuit of excellence. What if, instead of making her food more accessible to people who'd already dismissed it, she focused on making it undeniably excellent? What if she stopped translating her heritage and learned to present it with such skill that opposition became impossible? "I want to learn," she said finally. "Really learn. Not just family recipes and YouTube tutorials. I want to understand technique at a level where no one can dismiss what I'm doing as amateur or foreign." David sat across from her, recognizing the determined set of her jaw. "What are you thinking?" Maya pulled up Le Petit Jardin's website, sparse but elegant, with a single phone number and brief description. "I'm thinking about asking a master chef to teach me how to be undeniable." "Maya, these places don't usually take students. And the cost—" "Not culinary school, apprenticeship. Learning from someone who understands that food is art, not just sustenance. Someone who can teach me to cook so well that people like Richard Henderson have to acknowledge excellence even when they don't understand its origins." She thought about Nai's stories with new perspective. Her grandmother hadn't won over skeptical customers by making her food more American. She'd won them over by making it undeniably delicious, executing traditional dishes with such skill that cultural barriers became irrelevant. What if I could cater an event so spectacular, so perfectly executed that the same people who dismissed my cooking would be fighting for seconds? Maya's eyes brightened. What if I could show them what they missed because they were too narrow-minded to try something new? The idea crystallized as she spoke. Not just learning to cook better, but learning to cook so extraordinarily well that prejudice would crumble in the face of undeniable skill. She imagined Richard Henderson's face when presented with food so exquisite he couldn't help but praise it, only to discover it came from the woman he'd humiliated. David reached across the table and covered her hand. "I think Richard Henderson has no idea what he just unleashed." Maya squeezed his fingers, feeling something she hadn't experienced since Saturday night. Hope. Not the fragile hope of fitting in, but fierce hope of proving her worth on her own terms. If Grand Rapids wasn't ready for her heritage, she'd give them something they couldn't ignore. Mastery so complete it transcended cultural boundaries. The phone number for Le Petit Jardin seemed to pulse on her screen, challenging her to take the first step toward becoming the chef she'd never dared dream she could be. Maya Chen was done trying to belong. It was time to make them remember her name. The phone number for Le Petit Jardin seemed to pulse on her screen, challenging her to take the first step toward becoming the chef she'd never dared dream she could be. Maya Chen was done trying to belong. It was time to make them remember her name. But calling proved easier imagined than executed. For 2 days, Maya stared at the number, crafting and discarding dozens of potential conversations in her mind. What did one say to a Michelin-starred chef? How did you explain that you needed to learn excellence as a form of revenge without sounding completely unhinged? Friday afternoon, she finally drove out to find the restaurant instead. The 40-minute journey through Michigan's autumn countryside gave her time to rehearse her approach, though her carefully planned words evaporated the moment she saw Le Petit Jardin nestled among the maple trees. The building was smaller than she'd expected, a converted farmhouse with weathered stone walls and windows that glowed amber in the late afternoon light. No flashy signage, no parking lot full of luxury cars, Just a simple wooden sign carved, with the restaurant's name and a gravel driveway that wound between ancient oak trees. Maya sat in her car for 10 minutes, engine running, watching smoke curl from the building's chimney. Through the windows, she could see the soft flicker of candlelight on empty tables set with crisp white linens. The restaurant wouldn't open for dinner service for another 3 hours, but someone was clearly inside. Her hands trembled as she finally turned off the engine. The gravel crunched under her feet with each reluctant step toward the front door. She raised her hand to knock, then lowered it, then raised it again. This was insane. She was about to interrupt a world-renowned chef during prep time to ask for cooking lessons like some suburban housewife with delusions of grandeur. Before she could lose her nerve entirely, the door swung open. Chef Laurent Dubois was not what she'd expected. The food blog photos had shown him in pristine whites, composed and commanding in his kitchen. The man standing before her wore a "preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us." Now, back to the story. Flour-dusted apron over jeans and a thermal shirt, his graying hair escaping from a bandana. His eyes, pale blue and unnervingly direct, took her measure in a single glance. "We're closed," he said in accented English, his voice carrying the particular weariness of someone who'd answered this question countless times. "I know. I'm not here for dinner." Maya's voice came out smaller than she'd intended. "I was hoping to speak with you about learning." Laurent's expression didn't change, but he didn't immediately close the door. "Learning what? Exactly?" "Cooking. Real cooking. I mean..." Maya struggled to find words that wouldn't sound ridiculous. "I've been cooking all my life, but I want to understand technique at a professional level." "Classical technique. There are culinary schools for that." His tone suggested the conversation was over, but still he didn't move to close the door. "I don't want culinary school. I want to learn from someone who understands that food is more than just sustenance, someone who knows what it means to cook with purpose." The words tumbled out faster now, desperation overriding caution. "I read about your restaurant, about your background. I know you don't take students, but..." "You know nothing about me," Laurent interrupted, though his voice held more curiosity than irritation. "What makes you think I would teach you anything?" Maya felt the careful speech she'd rehearsed crumbling. Instead, she found herself speaking from the raw place that had driven her here. "Because someone told me my food was disgusting ethnic. Slop in front of an entire room of people. And I want to learn to cook so well that no one can ever dismiss me like that again." The words hung in the autumn air between them. Laurent's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a flicker of something that might have been recognition crossing his features. "And you think classical French technique will accomplish this revenge?" There was no mockery in his voice, only genuine question. "I think excellence transcends prejudice," Maya said quietly. "I think if I can cook well enough, beautifully enough, the source won't matter. They'll have to acknowledge the skill even if they don't understand the story behind it." Laurent was quiet for a long moment, studying her face with those unsettling pale eyes. She could hear sounds from the kitchen behind him, the methodical chop of knives, the sizzle of something hitting hot oil, his staff preparing for evening, service while she stood on his doorstep begging for validation. "What did you bring to this gathering where you were humiliated?" he asked finally. Maya blinked, surprised by the question. "Gua bao, Taiwanese steamed buns with 5-spice braised pork. I added local apple slaw to..." "Show me." "I'm sorry?" "Show me these steamed buns. Tomorrow. Bring them here at 2 o'clock. If they're as good as you believe they are, perhaps we have something to discuss." Maya's heart hammered against her ribs. "You want me to cook for you?" "I want to understand what you're capable of before I waste time on false hope." Laurent's expression remained neutral, but she caught something in his voice, Not encouragement exactly, but not dismissal either. If you cannot execute your grandmother's recipe with precision and soul, you have no business learning mine. And if I can, then we will see if you have the dedication necessary for what you're asking. He stepped back slightly, hand on the door. 2:00 tomorrow. Do not be late. The door closed with quiet finality, leaving Maya standing alone in the gravel driveway. She walked back to her car in a daze, Laurent's words echoing in her mind. If you cannot execute your grandmother's recipe with precision and soul, you have no business learning mine. The drive home passed in a blur of possibilities and terror. She had less than 24 hours to prepare the most important dish of her life, not for a neighborhood potluck where people might politely sample her offering, but for a master chef who would judge every element with professional scrutiny. Back in her kitchen, Maya called her grandmother. "Nai," she said when the familiar voice answered. "I need to know everything about the guabao. Everything you never told me because you thought I already knew." The conversation lasted 2 hours. Her grandmother walked her through subtleties she'd never considered: the precise temperature of water for the dough, the importance of resting time, the way humidity affected the steaming process. Maya took notes frantically, asking questions she'd never thought to ask in all her years of cooking beside her grandmother. "Why all these questions, Bao Bei?" Nai asked finally. "What has happened?" Maya found herself telling the story of the potluck, of Richard Henderson's cruelty, of her plan to learn from Chef Dubois. Her grandmother listened without interruption, occasionally making soft sounds of understanding or disapproval. "This chef," Nai said when Maya finished, "he is testing more than your cooking tomorrow." "What do you mean?" "He wants to see if you cook from anger or from love. Anger makes bitter food, no matter how perfect the technique. But love." Her grandmother's voice carried the weight of decades in restaurant kitchens. Love makes food that changes hearts. That night, Maya lay awake visualizing every step of the process, not just the mechanical actions, mixing dough, braising, pork, assembling buns, but the intention behind each movement. She thought about her grandmother's hands guiding hers when she was 7 years old, about the stories embedded in family recipes, about the difference between cooking for survival and cooking for transformation. Tomorrow, she would stand in front of Chef Laurent Dubois with a dish that represented everything she was and everything she hoped to become. The steamed buns would carry not just her technical skill, but her heritage, her heartbreak, and her determination to rise above both. Maya Chen was about to discover whether her dreams of culinary mastery were achievable reality or beautiful delusion. Either way, there would be no turning back after tomorrow. Maya Chen was about to discover whether her dreams of culinary mastery were achievable reality or beautiful delusion. Either way, there would be no turning back after tomorrow. She arrived at Le Petit Jardin at 1:58 p.m., her hands steady despite the hurricane of nerves in her chest. The bamboo steamer sat on the passenger seat beside her, containing 6 perfect gua bao that had taken her 4 attempts to achieve. Each failure had taught her something. The first batch too dense, the second under-seasoned, the third with dough that hadn't rested long enough. The 4th attempt, guided by Nai's whispered wisdom and her own growing understanding, had finally sung with the harmony she'd been chasing. Laurent opened the door before she could knock, as if he'd been watching from the window. Today he wore chef's whites, crisp and imposing, his pale eyes immediately dropping to the steamer in her hands. "Follow me," he said without preamble, leading her through the dining room to the kitchen beyond. The space took Maya's breath away. Every surface gleamed with professional perfection. Copper pots hanging in precise rows, knife blocks arranged with military precision, stations that spoke of efficiency born from decades of service. This wasn't the warm, lived-in kitchen of her grandmother's stories. This was a temple to culinary excellence. Laurent gestured to a marble prep station. "Show me." Maya's hands trembled slightly as she lifted the steamer's lid, revealing 6 pillowy buns nestled like sleeping birds. The aroma that escaped, 5-spice, star anise, the deep richness of properly braised pork, filled the sterile air with something indefinably comforting. Laurent selected one bun with the careful precision of a surgeon, examining its shape, the evenness of the dough, the way the filling peeked through translucent edges. He took a bite, chewing slowly, his expression revealing nothing. The silence stretched until Maya wanted to scream. She watched his face for any flicker of approval or disgust, but Laurent had perfected the art of culinary poker face. When he finally swallowed, he set the half-eaten bun down and looked at her directly. "The dough is properly developed, good gluten structure, appropriate hydration. The pork is correctly braised. You understand the importance of time and temperature." His voice carried no emotion, simply clinical assessment. "The apple slaw provides necessary acidity and textural contrast." Maya's heart sank. It sounded like praise, but delivered with all the warmth of a laboratory report. "However," Laurent continued, "you cook like someone afraid of her own food. Every element is technically correct, but there's no soul, no confidence. You're apologizing." With each bite, the words hit like a physical blow. Maya had spent 18 hours perfecting every element, had followed her grandmother's instructions to the letter, had tasted and adjusted until achieving what she thought was perfection. And still somehow it wasn't enough. "I don't understand," she whispered. "Your technique is adequate. Your fear is not." Laurent moved to his knife block, selecting a 10-inch chef's knife with practiced ease. "You want to learn classical French technique because you believe it will give you authority. But authority cannot be learned, it must be claimed." He gestured for her to join him at the prep station where vegetables for evening service waited in neat rows. "We will start with brunoise. Do you know what that means?" Maya nodded, though her definition was probably incomplete. "Show me." She selected a carrot from the mise en place, her hands automatically reaching for a knife. Laurent's hand stopped her. "Not that one. This one." He placed a different knife in her palm, heavier, perfectly balanced, the blade so sharp it seemed to cut air. A chef's tools matter, but more important is how she holds them. What followed was unlike any cooking lesson Maya had ever experienced. Laurent dismantled her knife technique with surgical precision, rebuilding it from the grip up. Her fingers, she learned, had been positioned incorrectly for 15 years. Her cutting motion lacked the rhythm that made professional kitchens hum. Even her stance was wrong. Feet too close together, shoulders hunched defensively. "Cooking is not just about feeding people," Laurent said, as Maya struggled to master the proper rocking motion. "It is about commanding space, ingredients, time. You must own your kitchen, not apologize for occupying it." Hour after hour, they worked through fundamentals Maya thought she'd mastered years ago. Laurent's corrections came swift and merciless. A eye, touch to realign her wrist, a sharp non. When her knife work grew sloppy, constant reminders to stand taller, move with purpose, claim her space. By 4 o'clock, Maya's back ached and her knife hand cramped, but something remarkable was happening. The vegetables emerging from her blade looked different, cleaner, more uniform, somehow more professional. More than that, she felt different. The apologetic hunch of her shoulders was straightening into something that might eventually become confidence. "Enough for today," Laurent announced as the first servers arrived for evening prep. "Tomorrow, 5:30 p.m., we work after service prep but before dinner. Bring better shoes and tie your hair properly. This is not a hobby kitchen." Maya looked down at her canvas sneakers and self-consciously touched the loose ponytail that had seemed adequate that morning. "What will we work on?" "Sauces. The foundation of everything. Laurent's expression softened almost imperceptibly. Your guabao were good, Maya Chen. Not great, but good. Good enough to build upon. The question is whether you're prepared for what building upon means. The drive home passed in a haze of exhaustion and exhilaration. Maya's hands still tingled from the unfamiliar weight of professional knives, her mind replaying every correction. Every moment when Laurent's instruction had clicked into understanding. She felt like she'd been speaking a language all her life only to discover she'd been mispronouncing every word. David was waiting in the kitchen when she arrived, his face carefully neutral. How did it go? He said yes, Maya replied, then paused. I think he said yes. He wants me to come back tomorrow. And how do you feel about that? Maya considered the question seriously. Her body ached, her pride was bruised, and she had a growing suspicion that everything she thought she knew about cooking was wrong. But underneath the exhaustion, something burned bright and determined. Terrified, she admitted. And excited. David, I've been cooking wrong for years. Not wrong exactly, but limited. Like I've been speaking in whispers when I could have been speaking clearly. Over the next 2 weeks, Maya's life developed a new rhythm. Work until 5, home to change clothes and grab a quick meal. Then the drive to Le Petit, Jardin for evening sessions that stretched until 9 or 10 p.m. Laurent proved to be a demanding but precise teacher, building her skills with architectural care. Knife work gave way to sauce fundamentals, mother sauces that formed the backbone of classical cuisine. Maya learned to make beurre blanc so smooth it looked like silk, bechamel that coated a spoon perfectly, hollandaise that held its emulsion, despite her nervous hands. Each sauce demanded different techniques, different attention, different kinds of patience. Temperature is everything, Laurent instructed as Maya whisked her third failed attempt at hollandaise. Too hot and it breaks. Too cool and it never comes together. Like trust, it requires the exact right conditions. The metaphor wasn't lost on her. Trust was exactly what this process required. Trust in Laurent's methods. Trust in her own developing abilities. Trust that the hours of repetitive practice would eventually transform into instinctive skill. David began to notice changes in how Maya moved through their home kitchen. Her knife work at dinner prep had developed a professional rhythm. She stood taller at the stove, moved with more purpose, seasoned with growing confidence rather than fearful tasting. You're different, he observed one evening, watching her julienne vegetables with mechanical precision. I'm learning to take up space, Maya replied, not looking up from her cutting board. Laurent says I've been cooking like I'm apologizing for existing. Apparently, good food requires the cook to believe she deserves to be in the kitchen. The revelation went deeper than technique. Maya was discovering that her insecurity about belonging in Grand Rapids had infected every aspect of her cooking. She'd been shrinking herself, making her food smaller and less distinctive, hoping to avoid the kind of attention that might lead to judgment. But Laurent demanded the opposite. He insisted she season boldly, present confidently, own every dish that emerged from her hands. Under his tutelage, Maya was learning that excellence was not just about technical skill. It was about the authority to trust your own palate, your own vision, your own right to create something beautiful and demand that others recognize its worth. 2 weeks into her training, as Maya successfully executed a perfect pan sauce for the 6th consecutive time, Laurent finally offered something approaching praise. Better, he said simply. You are beginning to cook like you belong in a kitchen. The words settled warm in her chest. For the first time since the potluck disaster, Maya felt like she was moving toward something instead of running away from it. She was becoming the chef she'd never dared dream she could be. 2 weeks into her training, as Maya successfully executed a perfect pan sauce for the 6th consecutive time, Laurent finally offered something approaching praise. Better, he said simply. You are beginning to cook like you belong in a kitchen. The words settled warm in her chest. For the first time since the potluck disaster, Maya felt like she was moving toward something instead of running away from it. She was becoming the chef she'd never dared dream she could be. But that evening, as Maya cleaned her station with the methodical precision Laurent demanded, she found herself watching him prepare for dinner service with a different kind of attention. His movements held an authority she was only beginning to understand. The way he tasted a sauce and immediately knew what it needed. How he could plate a dish with artistic precision while simultaneously monitoring 3 other preparations. "Laurent," she said carefully, not wanting to break the fragile trust they'd built, "I need to tell you why I'm really here." He paused in his preparation, a spoon of velouté halfway to his mouth. "I assumed you wanted to become a better cook." "I do, but that's not the whole truth." Maya set down her towel and faced him, directly. "I want to cater an event, a specific event, for the people who humiliated me." Laurent's pale eyes studied her with new interest. "Revenge through cuisine. How very French." "Not revenge exactly. Vindication." Maya's voice grew stronger as the words found their shape. "I want to cook for them so brilliantly that they can't deny what they're tasting. I want them to praise my food without knowing it's mine, and then reveal myself at the moment they're most impressed." Laurent set down his spoon entirely, giving her his full attention. "And you think I will help you with this theatrical performance? I think you understand what it means to have your work dismissed by people who don't have the palate to judge it." Maya had researched Laurent's background thoroughly, knew about the scandal that had driven him from Chicago. "I think you know what it feels like to have excellence questioned by those who mistake their ignorance for authority." The kitchen fell silent except for the gentle bubble of reducing stocks. Laurent moved to the prep counter where Maya had been working, running his finger along the edge to check for remaining residue. His standards for cleanliness were as exacting as his standards for everything else. "Tell me about this event," he said finally. Maya's heart hammered as she outlined what she knew. The Hendersons' 25th anniversary party, their struggle to find a caterer worthy of their self-perceived status, their tendency to hire based on reputation rather than research. They want someone exclusive, someone who will impress their guests. They want to be able to boast about their choice. And you propose we give them that opportunity. Laurent's tone revealed nothing of his thoughts. "I propose we give them the best catering they've ever experienced, executed with such skill that their guests spend the entire evening praising their excellent taste." Maya's voice carried growing conviction. "And then, when everyone is thoroughly convinced of the quality, I reveal myself as the chef." Laurent was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming against the stainless steel counter. "What makes you think they would hire a catering service they've never heard of?" "Because you're Laurent Dubois. Your name carries weight, even in Grand Rapids. If Chef Laurent's exclusive catering service approached them, they wouldn't dare turn it down." "Ah." Laurent's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "You want to use my reputation as bait." Maya's courage nearly failed her. Laid out so bluntly, the plan sounded presumptuous, manipulative, possibly insulting to the man who'd been generously sharing his expertise. "I know it's a lot to ask." "It's brilliant," Laurent interrupted, his tone carrying a note of admiration. That surprised them both. Audacious and slightly insane, but brilliant. These people humiliated you for being different, so you propose to defeat them with excellence they cannot question. Relief flooded through Maya's chest. "Then you'll help me?" "I will consider it, but first you must prove you're capable of executing such a plan." Laurent moved to his knife roll, selecting tools for evening prep. "What you're proposing isn't just about cooking well. It's about orchestrating a complete dining experience under pressure, with stakes higher than you've ever faced. Can you do that?" Maya thought about the question seriously. 2 weeks ago, she would have said no without hesitation, but something had shifted during her training. The frightened home cook who'd packed up her untouched steamers was evolving into someone who could hold professional knives with confidence, who could stand tall in a kitchen, who could season boldly and own her choices. I think so. With your help. Then we design a menu, Laurent said decisively. But not just any menu. Something that showcases classical technique while honoring your heritage. Something that tells your story through flavors they cannot ignore. Over the following week, their training sessions transformed into collaborative planning. Laurent pushed Maya to think beyond individual dishes toward complete flavor profiles, textural contrasts, visual presentations that would photograph beautifully for social media. They needed food that would impress on multiple levels. Technically, perfect for Laurent's professional reputation, culturally meaningful for Maya's personal journey, and accessible enough for a suburban Grand Rapids palate. Start with what you know, Laurent advised as they sketched preliminary menus. Your gua bao, but elevated. What would that look like with perfect French technique applied to Taiwanese flavors? Maya found herself thinking about her grandmother's recipes through Laurent's lens of classical precision. The 5-spice blend that had seemed like simple tradition suddenly revealed layers of complexity when applied with professional understanding. The braising technique Nai Nai had taught her could be refined with proper temperature control and timing. Even the steaming method could be perfected with Laurent's knowledge of humidity and heat distribution. Duck confit bao with 5-spice and pickled Asian pear, Maya suggested during one planning session. The confit technique gives us that classical French foundation, but the flavors are purely Taiwanese. Better. The duck fat will carry the 5-spice beautifully, and the pickled pear provides necessary acidity. Laurent made notes in his precise handwriting. What about soup course? Hot and sour soup, but clarified like a consommé. All the traditional flavors, wood ear mushrooms, tofu, white pepper, but presented with classical clarity. Laurent's eyebrows rose slightly. Interesting. Technically challenging. You would need to master consommé technique completely. Then teach me. And he did. Maya learned to clarify stocks with raft techniques that turned cloudy broths crystal clear while preserving every nuance of flavor. She practiced tempering eggs for silky liaison sauces, studied the precise timing required for perfect emulsions, discovered how classical French methods could amplify rather than mask the distinctive flavors of her heritage. Each evening, David watched Maya return home more energized despite her obvious exhaustion. Her notebook filled with menu plans, technique notes, timing charts that looked like military operations. She spoke about food with a new vocabulary: mother, sauces and knife cuts, liaison and mise en place. But underneath the professional terminology, her passion burned brighter than ever. You're planning something, David observed one evening as Maya practiced brunoise cuts on carrots that would only be used for stock. I'm planning everything, Maya replied, not looking up from her cutting board. Laurent and I are designing a menu that will be absolutely undeniable. French technique, Taiwanese soul, executed so perfectly that no one can question its excellence. For the Henderson party? For my future. Maya's knife work had developed a hypnotic rhythm, each cut precise and confident. This isn't just about proving Richard Henderson wrong anymore. It's about proving to myself that I belong wherever I choose to be. That excellence creates its own space. 3 weeks into menu development, Laurent presented Maya with a challenge. That would test everything she'd learned. Cook the complete appetizer course for my dinner service tomorrow night. 4 dishes, 40 covers each. If you can execute under real pressure, with real stakes, then we move forward with your plan. Maya's stomach dropped. Cooking for Laurent's discerning clientele was a completely different proposition than practicing in an empty kitchen. These were people who expected perfection, who could detect any flaw in technique or seasoning. If she failed, she wouldn't just disappoint Laurent, she'd potentially damage his reputation. What if I'm not ready? Then you're not ready, but I think you are. Laurent's pale eyes held something that might have been confidence. The question is whether you think you are. Maya thought about the woman who'd driven to Le Petit Jardin 6 weeks ago, desperate and defeated, begging for validation. That woman would never have attempted what Laurent was proposing, but she wasn't that woman anymore. She was someone who could stand tall in professional kitchens, who could execute classical techniques with growing precision, who had learned to cook with authority rather than apology. Yes, she said quietly. I'm ready. Laurent nodded once, sharp and decisive. Tomorrow, then, we see if Maya Chen has truly become a chef. The words carried weight beyond the immediate challenge. Tomorrow would determine whether her dreams of culinary vindication were achievable reality or beautiful delusion. Tomorrow would prove whether she'd truly transformed from victim to victor, or whether she was still the same insecure home cook hiding behind borrowed confidence. Maya Chen was about to discover exactly who she'd become. Maya Chen was about to discover exactly who she'd become. The next evening arrived with the weight of judgment. Maya stood in Le Petit Jardin's kitchen at 4 p.m., wearing proper chef's whites, for the first time. Around her, the evening prep crew moved with practiced efficiency, making her feel like an intruder despite weeks of training. 4 appetizer courses, Laurent reminded her. Duck confit bao, tea-smoked salmon with miso aioli, 5-spice pork belly and your consommé. 40 covers each. Service begins at 6. Maya nodded, checking her mise en place one final time. Everything was prepared as Laurent had taught her, but executing under pressure was a different universe entirely. The first hour passed in controlled chaos. Maya's hands moved through familiar motions, confiding duck legs at precisely controlled temperature, smoking salmon over jasmine tea leaves, reducing stocks for the consommé base. Laurent monitored her progress with surgical intensity. Your brunoise is inconsistent, he called out during vegetable prep. Precision matters more when you're stressed, not less. At 5:30, Laurent called for a taste of each dish. Maya's heart hammered as she plated samples representing weeks of technique refinement. The duck bao looked professional, pillowy steamed, buns cradling perfectly confited duck with 5-spice that had melded beautifully. The salmon gleamed under its delicate miso aioli coating. Laurent tasted each dish methodically, his expression revealing nothing. The kitchen fell silent except for bubbling sauces and ventilation fans. The duck is properly confited, he said finally. Good fat rendering, appropriate seasoning balance. The salmon shows technique. You controlled the smoking well. Maya felt her shoulders drop slightly. Not failure, but not triumph either. However, Laurent continued, all 4 dishes demonstrate competent execution under pressure. More importantly, they tell a coherent story. You have earned the right to proceed with your plan. Relief and exhilaration flooded through Maya's chest simultaneously. She'd passed Laurent's test, proven she could execute professional-level cuisine when stakes were real. Don't thank me yet, Laurent called over his shoulder. Now we execute the difficult part. Over the following week, Maya and Laurent crafted the deception that would get them hired for the Henderson anniversary party. Creating Chef Laurent's exclusive catering required attention to detail that rivaled their menu planning, professional, website design, carefully curated social media presence, references from Laurent's longtime customers willing to participate in their elaborate ruse. People see what they want to see, Laurent explained as they reviewed the polished website. The Hendersons want exclusivity and prestige. We're offering exactly that. The crucial phone call came on a Thursday evening. Maya sat in Laurent's office, hands trembling slightly as she dialed the Henderson number. Henderson residence, Susan's voice answered. Good evening, Mrs. Henderson. This is Patricia Chen from Chef Laurent's exclusive catering. Maya had chosen to use her real surname but an anglicized first name, a small act of rebellion. I'm calling regarding your anniversary celebration on November 15th. Oh, you're returning our call about catering services? Actually, we don't typically take new clients this time of year, Maya replied, following their script. However, Chef Laurent received a personal recommendation about your event from Mrs. Whitmore at the country club. Maya held her breath. Mrs. Whitmore was Laurent's customer who'd agreed to provide a reference if asked. Mrs. Whitmore recommended us? Susan's voice carried surprise and pleasure. The Whitmores occupied a social tier the Hendersons aspired to reach. She mentioned that you were seeking something truly exceptional for your 25th anniversary. Chef Laurent rarely does private events anymore. He's quite selective. But Mrs. Whitmore was quite insistent that we make an exception. Maya could practically hear Susan's social calculations. Being personally recommended by Mrs. Whitmore to a chef who rarely did private events was exactly the exclusive access that would impress their guest list. We would be very interested in discussing this opportunity, Susan said carefully. Maya launched into their presentation, a sophisticated 7-course tasting menu showcasing classical technique with subtle Asian influences, described in language that emphasized artistry and exclusivity rather than specific cultural origins. The 5 spice elements were presented as exotic aromatics, traditional preparations reframed as innovative fusion techniques. It sounds absolutely perfect, Susan breathed, but I have to ask about availability. We've been struggling to find someone of appropriate caliber. November 15th is challenging, but I believe Chef Laurent could make it work for the right event. Maya paused strategically. There would be a premium for the short notice and exclusivity, of course. By the end of the conversation, Susan, Henderson was practically purring with satisfaction at having secured such an exclusive caterer. I'll need to confirm with my husband, of course, but I'm confident we'll want to move forward. When can we expect a formal proposal? I'll have Chef Laurent's office send over the complete package tomorrow, Maya promised. We look forward, to making your anniversary truly memorable. After hanging up, Maya sat in stunned silence. It had worked. The elaborate deception, the manufactured reputation, the careful appeal to status, all of it had combined to achieve exactly what they'd planned. How do you feel? Laurent asked. Maya considered the question seriously. 6 weeks ago, she would have felt guilty about the deception, anxious about the complexity of what they were attempting. But the woman sitting in Laurent's office had been forged by weeks of rigorous training, had learned to claim space rather than apologize for occupying it. I feel ready, she said quietly. For the first time since that potluck, I feel completely ready. The phone call from Susan Henderson came exactly when predicted, 2 days after receiving their proposal. Chef Laurent's office? This is Susan. Henderson, we've reviewed your proposal and we'd like to move forward immediately. The menu sounds absolutely divine, and Richard is particularly excited about the wine pairings. Maya smiled as she confirmed the booking. Excellent, Mrs. Henderson. Chef Laurent is very pleased to be part of your special evening. We'll arrive at 4 o'clock on November 15th to begin setup. I think you'll find the experience quite memorable. After hanging up, Maya sat quietly in her kitchen, surrounded by the tools and techniques that had transformed her from victim to victor. In 10 days, she would walk into the Henderson home not as their dismissed neighbor, but as the chef who would give them the finest dining experience of their lives. And then, at the moment of their greatest satisfaction, she would remove her chef's hat and show them exactly who had been responsible for their perfect evening. Maya Chen was no longer trying to belong. She was about to make them remember her name. Maya Chen was no longer trying to belong. She was about to make them remember her name. But with 7 days left before the Henderson anniversary party, the weight of what she'd committed to began settling into her bones like Michigan winter. What if someone recognized her despite the chef's whites? What if her technique faltered under pressure? What if the Hendersons' home kitchen lacked the equipment for her carefully planned menu? Maya found herself lying awake at 3 a.m., mentally rehearsing every element. She'd practiced each dish until muscle memory took over. But cooking in Laurent's professional kitchen was vastly different from working in someone's home setup. "You're spiraling," David observed Wednesday morning, watching Maya reorganize her spice collection for the third time that week. "I can hear you thinking from the next room." "I took vacation days for final prep," Maya said, not looking up from carefully labeled containers. "Laurent wants me to practice the complete menu timeline twice more before Saturday. Every minute matters when coordinating 7 courses for 40 people." David sat across from her, recognizing the particular intensity that meant his wife was processing something larger than menu planning. "Maya, what's really going on? This is more than pre-performance nerves." She paused, a jar of Sichuan peppercorns suspended between her hands. For weeks, she'd focused on technical aspects while avoiding the emotional complexity of what she was attempting. "I'm terrified," she admitted quietly. "Not of the cooking. I know I can execute the food. I'm terrified of the moment when I reveal myself, of seeing their faces, of having to stand there while they process that the woman they dismissed created the most extraordinary meal they've ever experienced." David reached across and covered her hand. "What if they don't process it the way you expect? What if they're too stubborn or embarrassed to acknowledge what you've accomplished?" The question hit Maya's deepest fear. She'd built this revenge around the assumption that excellence would be undeniable, that skill would transcend prejudice. But what if Richard Henderson's bigotry ran so deep, he'd diminish her achievement even when confronted with irrefutable evidence? "Then I'll know," Maya said finally. "I'll know I tried everything possible to earn their respect through legitimate means. And I'll also know I'm capable of creating something extraordinary regardless of whether they acknowledge it." Thursday. Evening, Maya arrived at Le Petit Jardin to find Laurent waiting with an unexpected addition, Mrs. Eleanor Kowalski, sitting at the prep counter with tea and a knowing smile. "Eleanor?" Maya stopped short, confused by her neighbor's presence. "Hello, dear," Eleanor said calmly. "Laurent called me yesterday. Seems he thought you might benefit from conversation with someone who witnessed your original humiliation firsthand." "I thought you might want to practice your revelation speech," Laurent said, sharpening knives with studied nonchalance. "Eleanor has agreed to serve as your test audience." "Know about it?" "Child, I've been waiting for you to do something like this since that awful potluck night." Eleanor's eyes sparkled with approval. "Laurent explained your scheme. It's brilliant, audacious, and exactly what those pretentious fools deserve." Maya felt unexpected relief at having a witness to her transformation, someone who remembered the woman she'd been and could validate who she'd become. "But I'm not here just to cheer you on," Eleanor continued, her voice taking on the firm tone of someone who'd spent 40 years managing classrooms. "I'm here because Laurent is concerned about your execution of the final moment. The cooking part, you've mastered. The psychological theater of your revelation, that requires different skills." Over 2 hours, Maya practiced not just menu timing, but the choreography of her grand reveal. How to enter the dining room with appropriate drama. How to remove her chef's hat with confidence. How to speak clearly when announcing her identity to shocked guests. "Remember," Eleanor coached, "you're not apologizing for deceiving them. You're not asking forgiveness. You're simply stating facts, who you are, what you've accomplished, and what it means. Let them process their own embarrassment." Friday brought Maya's final practice run, 7 courses timed to the minute, with Laurent playing exacting host and Eleanor serving as critical diner. Maya moved through preparation with growing confidence, her knife work automatic, seasoning instinctive, plating artistic without being precious. As she finished the final course, delicate green tea panna cotta with black sesame tuile, David arrived looking unusually serious. "Maya, we need to talk," he said, his engineer's mind clearly working through some complex problem. They stepped outside into November chill, where David's breath formed small clouds. "I've been thinking about this plan. About what happens after Saturday night." "What do you mean?" "I mean, what happens when word gets out? Because it will. The food blogging community in Grand Rapids isn't large, and someone will definitely write about this story." David's voice carried concern but also growing excitement. "Maya, you're about to become famous, not just in our neighborhood but potentially beyond. Are you prepared for that?" Maya hadn't considered broader implications. She'd been so focused on immediate satisfaction that she hadn't thought about ripple effects. "I don't know," she admitted. "I've been so focused on Saturday night that I haven't thought about Sunday morning." "Well, start thinking about it. Because if this goes the way Laurent predicts, you're going to have opportunities you never imagined. Catering requests, restaurant offers, maybe even cookbook deals. You're about to transform from medical office administrator to celebrity chef in a single evening." That night, Maya called her grandmother, needing to hear Nai-Nai's voice before Sao, taking the final step. "Bao Bei," her grandmother said warmly. "Are you ready for tomorrow?" "I think so. The food is perfect. Laurent says I'm executing at professional level. But Nai-Nai, I'm scared about what comes after." Her grandmother was quiet for a long moment. "When I opened my restaurant 60 years ago, I was terrified every single day for the first year. Terrified of failure, terrified of success, terrified of being judged, terrified of being ignored. But you know what I learned?" "What?" "Fear means you're about to do something important, something that matters. If you weren't scared, it would mean this didn't matter to you." Her grandmother's voice carried decades of wisdom. "Tomorrow night, you cook with love and pride. You show them who you really are. Whatever comes after, we handle together." Saturday morning arrived crisp and clear, November sunlight streaming through her kitchen windows. Maya stood at her stove making congee one final time, the simple rice porridge that had sustained her through dark moments and brought her back to her love of cooking. In 6 hours, she would walk into the Henderson home as Chef Laurent's head chef. In 8 hours, she would reveal herself as the architect of their perfect evening. In 9 hours, she would know whether she'd truly changed not just her skills, but her place in the world. Maya Chen was no longer afraid. She was ready to claim her space. Maya Chen was no longer afraid. She was ready to claim her space. At 4 p.m. sharp, Maya pulled into the Henderson driveway behind Laurent's catering van, her heart steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to attempt. The familiar colonial house looked different through her chef's eyes, not the intimidating fortress of social hierarchy she'd once perceived, but simply a venue where she would execute the performance of her lifetime. Laurent emerged from the van wearing pristine chef's whites, his presence commanding immediate respect. Maya followed suit, her own whites fitting like armor, her knife rolls slung over her shoulder with professional confidence. They moved with the synchronized efficiency of a team that had practiced this moment dozens of times. "Mrs. Henderson," Laurent greeted Susan, who appeared at the front door practically vibrating with excitement. "I am Chef Laurent Dubois. This is my head chef, Maya." He gestured to Maya without elaboration, allowing Susan's assumptions to fill the gaps. "Oh, Chef Dubois, we're so honored to have you here," Susan gushed, her eyes taking in Laurent's impressive presence, before briefly acknowledging Maya with the polite but dismissive glance typically reserved for kitchen staff. Richard is beside himself with excitement. "He's been telling everyone about our exclusive caterer." Maya felt a familiar sting at being overlooked, but this time it carried no hurt, only anticipation. Susan Henderson had no idea she was greeting the architect of her evening's triumph, the woman whose food she would soon praise without recognition. "We'll need complete access to your kitchen for the next 4 hours," Laurent said with quiet authority. "I prefer my team work without interruption during preparation." Of course. Whatever you need. The kitchen is all yours." Maya followed Laurent through the house, noting the expensive but generic furnishings. The wine collection displayed more for status than passion. The careful staging that spoke of people trying desperately to project sophistication they didn't naturally possess. The kitchen itself was well-equipped but clearly underutilized, high-end appliances that gleamed with the neglect of disuse. "Perfect," Laurent murmured, running his hands over the gas range and examining the oven capacity. "More than adequate for our purposes." Maya began unpacking their equipment with methodical precision. Every tool had been selected specifically for this kitchen, every ingredient measured and prepared for maximum efficiency. She moved through the space with growing confidence, claiming territory with the unconscious authority Laurent had spent months teaching her to cultivate. "Remember," Laurent said quietly as they began their mise en place, "you are not a guest in this kitchen tonight. You are the chef. This is your domain for the next 6 hours." The transformation was immediate and complete. Maya's shoulders straightened. Her movements became more decisive. Her voice carried new authority as she coordinated their preparation. The weeks of training had fundamentally changed not just her technique, but her relationship to culinary space. She belonged here because she had earned the right to belong here. The first guests arrived at 6:30, their voices carrying through the house as Susan and Richard played host in the living room. Maya could hear Richard's booming laughter, his obvious delight at being able to casually mention his exclusive caterer, and the difficulty of securing such prestigious services. "The first course goes out in 15 minutes, Maya announced, plating the amuse-bouche with artistic precision. Delicate spoons held pearls of her crystalline consommé, each one a perfect balance of umami depth and visual elegance. The familiar flavors of her heritage had been refined through classical technique into something that transcended cultural boundaries while honoring their origins. Laurent carried the first course into the dining room with ceremonial gravity, returning moments later with a satisfied expression. "They're impressed," he reported. "Richard Henderson is already pontificating about the complexity of the broth. To anyone who will listen." Maya felt a flutter of vindication, quickly suppressed. This was only the beginning. The evening progressed with clockwork precision. Each course emerged from Maya's hands more spectacular than the last. Tea-smoked salmon that drew audible gasps, duck confit bao that prompted requests for the recipe. 5-spice pork belly so perfectly executed that even the most conservative palates couldn't resist second helpings. Through the kitchen's service window, Maya could glimpse the dining room where 40 guests savored her food with obvious delight. She recognized many faces from the neighborhood potluck, the Patels, the Johnsons, Mrs. Kowalski seated near the Kai, head of the table with an expression of barely contained amusement. "Maya," Laurent called her attention to the service window. "Look." She peered through to see Richard Henderson holding court at the head of the table, wineglass raised, addressing his guests with the pompous satisfaction of someone basking in reflected glory. "Simply extraordinary. The chef's technique is flawless, absolutely flawless. You can taste the classical training in every bite," Richard was declaring. "This is why you pay for true exclusivity, true artistry. Anyone can hire a caterer, but this is culinary mastery." Maya watched her former tormentor praise her food with passionate enthusiasm, completely unaware that he was celebrating the work of the woman he'd dismissed as producing disgusting ethnic slop. The irony was so perfect it felt scripted. "How does it feel?" Laurent asked quietly, watching Maya's face as she observed Richard's unwitting tribute. "Satisfying," Maya admitted. "But also strange. He's not wrong about the food, it is excellent. I just wish he could have recognized that before I had to hide behind your reputation to make him taste it." By the time the main course was served, her grandmother's traditional red-cooked pork reimagined with classical French technique and elegant presentation, the dining room had reached a state of culinary euphoria. Guests were taking photos, requesting business cards, asking about availability for their own events. Maya could hear Susan Henderson fielding questions about how they'd discovered such an extraordinary caterer. her voice glowing with social triumph. "Well, we have our sources," Susan was saying with practiced mystery. "Richard has always had exceptional taste when it comes to these things." The final course, green tea panna cotta with black sesame tuilo and candied ginger, prompted a spontaneous round of applause from the dining room. Maya watched through the service window as guests lingered over every spoonful, their expressions showing the particular satisfaction that comes from experiencing something genuinely special. "It's time," Laurent said quietly, checking his watch. "They're at peak appreciation. Their defenses are down, their preconceptions shattered by excellence. If you're going to reveal yourself, this is the moment." Maya looked down at her chefs, whites, now stained with the evidence of her evening's work. In her reflection in the kitchen's stainless steel surfaces, she saw not the insecure woman who'd fled the potluck in humiliation, but a chef who had just executed a flawless 7-course dinner for 40 demanding guests. The transformation was complete. She untied her apron, smoothed her hair, and picked up her chef's hat. Through the service window, she could see the dining room filled with satisfied guests, wine glasses raised in toasts to Richard and Susan's excellent taste, voices praising the mysterious chef's exceptional skill. "Remember what Eleanor taught you," Laurent said, his pale eyes holding steady encouragement. "You're not apologizing. You're not asking permission. You're simply stating facts." Maya nodded once, sharp and decisive. She had spent months becoming worthy of this moment. Not just technically, but personally. She had learned to cook with authority, to stand tall in professional kitchens, to claim space rather than apologize for occupying it. Now it was time to show the Hendersons and their guests exactly who had been responsible for their perfect evening. Time to prove that excellence came not from exclusivity or social status, but from skill, passion, and the courage to demand recognition on one's own terms. Chen straightened her shoulders, walked toward the dining room, and prepared to claim her victory. Chen straightened her shoulders, walked toward the dining room, and prepared to claim her victory. The dining room hummed with contentment. 40 guests lingered over the final course, their faces glowing with the particular satisfaction that comes from experiencing something extraordinary. Wine glasses caught the candlelight. Conversations flowed with the ease of people who felt sophisticated and well-fed, and Richard Henderson basked in the reflected glory of having secured such an exceptional caterer. Maya paused in the doorway, taking in the scene one final time before changing it forever. Mrs. Kowalski caught her eye from across the room and offered the slightest nod of encouragement. The elderly woman's presence felt like an anchor, a witness to both Maya's humiliation and her transformation. "Ladies and gentlemen," Maya said, her voice carrying clearly across the room. Conversations died mid-sentence. 40 heads turned toward the kitchen doorway where she stood in her chef's whites, no longer hiding behind Laurent's reputation, but claiming her own space with quiet authority. "If I could have your attention for just a moment," Maya continued, stepping fully into the dining room. Her voice was steady, professional, carrying none of the tremor that might have betrayed the magnitude of what she was about to reveal. Richard Henderson looked up from his wine with mild annoyance. "Is there a problem with the service? Because, I have to say, everything has been absolutely—" "There's no problem, Mr. Henderson," Maya interrupted gently, removing her chef's hat with deliberate ceremony. "I simply wanted to introduce myself properly. I'm Chen, and I've been your chef this evening." The silence that followed was profound. Maya watched recognition dawn on faces throughout the room, some immediately, others after a moment of confused processing. The Patel's eyes widened in amazement. Janet Johnson's hand flew to her mouth. Several guests who'd never seen Maya before looked puzzled by the sudden tension that had filled the room. Richard Henderson's face cycled through confusion, recognition, and dawning horror in the space of 3 seconds. His wine glass froze halfway to his lips as the full implications of Maya's presence crashed over him. "You," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Yes, Maya replied calmly. Me, the woman whose cooking you called disgusting ethnic slop 6 months ago. I wanted you to know that every dish you've praised tonight, every technique you've admired, every flavor you've declared extraordinary, came from my hands, my heritage, my grandmother's recipes refined through classical French training. Susan Henderson looked between her husband and Maya with growing comprehension, her social instincts warring with the undeniable evidence of what she'd just experienced. But you're the neighbor who brought those strange little sandwiches to the potluck. Gua bao, Maya corrected gently. Taiwanese steamed buns. Not so different from the duck confit bao you had as your third course tonight, which you described as absolutely divine about an hour ago. The room remained frozen, guests processing the revelation that their entire evening had been orchestrated by someone they'd either ignored or actively dismissed. Maya felt the weight of their stares, but no longer experienced it as judgment. She had earned her place in this room through undeniable skill. This is impossible, Richard sputtered, his face reddening with embarrassment and anger. We hired Chef Laurent Dubois. We specifically requested— You hired Chef Laurent's exclusive catering, Maya interrupted, her voice carrying new authority. Chef Laurent served as my partner and mentor in this endeavor, but every dish you've enjoyed tonight was conceived, prepared, and executed by me. The same hands that made the food you rejected 6 months ago created the meal you've been calling culinary mastery all evening. Mrs. Kowalski chose that moment to raise her wine glass in a toast. To Maya Chen, she announced clearly, who has just demonstrated that excellence speaks louder than prejudice. The gesture hung in the air, challenging the room to respond. Several guests followed Eleanor's lead, the Patels, the Johnsons, a few others who had witnessed the original humiliation and now understood the magnitude of Maya's achievement. But others remained frozen, unsure how to process the complete reversal of their assumptions. They had spent the evening praising food they would have dismissed if they'd known its true source. The cognitive dissonance was almost visible on their faces. How dare you! Richard Henderson exploded, rising from his chair with enough force to rattle the wine glasses. How dare you come into my home under false pretenses, manipulate my guests, make fools of us all with this elaborate deception? I didn't make fools of anyone, Maya replied, her voice remaining calm despite Richard's obvious fury. I simply gave you the opportunity to judge my food on its merits rather than your preconceptions. You praised every dish tonight because it was genuinely excellent, not because you were deceived about its quality. This is fraud, misrepresentation. We'll sue for what? Laurent's voice cut through Richard's bluster as he appeared, in the doorway behind Maya. For providing exactly the service you contracted for? For delivering a meal that exceeded every expectation? Your guests have experienced an extraordinary evening. The fact that you're uncomfortable with who provided, it says more about you than about us. Susan Henderson had been watching the exchange with growing distress, her social instincts finally overriding her husband's rage. She rose from her chair and moved toward Maya with hesitant steps. Maya, she said quietly, her voice carrying something that might have been genuine emotion. That night at the potluck, I should have said something. When Richard spoke the way he did, I should have defended your food. I knew it was wrong, but I was too cowardly to speak up. The admission hung between them, more honest than anything Susan had said in years. Maya studied the other woman's face, seeing past the careful makeup and social polish to something approaching authentic regret. Your food tonight, Susan continued, it was extraordinary. Not just technically perfect, but it told a story. It made me understand things about flavor and culture that I'd never experienced before. I'm ashamed that it took this elaborate lesson for me to see what was in front of me all along. Maya felt something shift in her chest. Not forgiveness exactly, but a recognition that Susan Henderson was capable of growth in ways her husband might not be. "Thank you," she said simply. "That means more than you know." The room buzzed, with uncomfortable conversations as guests processed the evening's revelation. Some were clearly embarrassed by their complicity in the original incident. Others seemed genuinely amazed by Maya's transformation and the audacity of her plan. A few appeared to be calculating the social implications of having been part of this story. James Murphy, the food blogger, had been typing furiously on his phone throughout the exchange. Maya caught his eye and saw his expression of pure journalistic excitement. This story would be online within hours, she realized. By tomorrow, her elaborate revenge would be public knowledge throughout Grand Rapids and beyond. "So what happens now?" Richard demanded, his anger giving way to something that looked almost like panic. "You've humiliated us in front of our friends, made us look like fools. What's your endgame here?" Maya considered the question seriously. 6 months ago, she might have wanted Richard Henderson to grovel, to publicly acknowledge his bigotry and beg forgiveness. But the woman standing in this dining room had moved beyond the need for his validation. "Nothing happens now," she said, quietly. "You've experienced exceptional food created by someone you dismissed as inferior. Your guests have seen that excellence can come from unexpected sources. You have the choice to learn from this experience or to remain exactly who you were 6 months ago. That's entirely up to you." She looked around the room one final time, meeting the eyes of neighbors who had witnessed both her humiliation and her triumph. "Thank you all for a memorable evening. I hope the food gave you as much pleasure to eat as it gave me to create." Maya turned to leave, Laurent falling into step beside her. As they reached the doorway, Mrs. Kowalski's voice carried clearly across the suddenly quiet room. "Maya, dear," the elderly woman called out, "I hope you'll consider catering my birthday party next month. I have a feeling your dance card is about to get very full." The laughter that followed them out of the Henderson dining room was warm, appreciative, and filled with the recognition that they had just witnessed something extraordinary. Maya Chen had not just prepared a meal, she had orchestrated a transformation, both of herself and of everyone who had tasted her food. As they packed their equipment in the Henderson kitchen, Maya felt the weight of the evening settling into something deeper than satisfaction. She had proven her point, claimed her victory, and discovered something profound about the relationship between skill and recognition. "How do you feel?" Laurent asked as they loaded the van. Maya considered the question as she secured her knife, while thinking about the journey that had brought her from humiliation to triumph. "Complete," she said finally. "Like I finally know who I am as a chef, regardless of who recognizes it." The transformation was absolute. Maya Chen was no longer seeking approval or trying to belong. She had become someone worthy of her own respect, and that would always be enough. The transformation was absolute. Maya Chen was no longer seeking approval or trying to belong. She had become someone worthy of her own respect, and that would always be enough. But Maya woke Sunday morning to discover that the world had other plans. Her phone buzzed incessantly from the nightstand, notification after notification piling up like digital applause. James Murphy's blog post had gone live at 6 a.m. with the headline, "The Most Brilliant Culinary Revenge in Grand Rapids History," and the story was spreading through social media with viral velocity. "Maya," David called from the kitchen, his voice carrying amazement. "You need to see this." She padded downstairs to find David at his laptop, scrolling through hundreds of comments, shares, and reactions. The story had been picked up by food bloggers across Michigan, then regional outlets, and was now trending on national food websites. "Listen to this," David said, reading from the screen. "This is what happens when ignorance meets excellence. Maya Chen just gave a master class in using skill to combat prejudice. That has 12,000 likes already." Maya sank beside him, watching numbers climb in real time. Shares, comments, media requests. interview invitations, all flowing from her simple act of revealing herself 12 hours earlier. 3 different food magazines want interviews. 2 Detroit restaurant groups have left voicemails offering jobs. And David paused, double-checking. The Food Network wants to discuss a potential show. The phone rang before she could process the implications. Laurent's voice was calm but amused. "I assume you've seen the coverage," he said without preamble. "It's overwhelming. I never expected—" "You should have. Excellence combined with a compelling story? In our social media age, this was inevitable." Laurent paused. "The question is what you plan to do about it." Maya looked around her familiar kitchen, the space where she'd transformed from medical office administrator to chef. It felt smaller somehow, no longer capable of containing what she'd become. 6 months ago, I would have been terrified by this attention. Now you're ready for it," Laurent finished. "You've proven yourself capable of executing under pressure, of creating excellence consistently. The only question is how big you want to dream." Mrs. Kowalski appeared at her back door around noon, carrying homemade cookies and wearing undisguised pride. "Thought you might need sustenance," Eleanor said, settling into Maya's kitchen. "I've been fielding calls all morning from neighbors wanting invitations to your next event." Maya laughed. "What next event? Yesterday I was a medical office administrator, with evening cooking lessons. Today apparently I'm supposed to have a culinary empire." "And what's wrong with that?" Eleanor asked pointedly. "You've spent months learning to cook like a professional. You've demonstrated execution under pressure. Why wouldn't you build on that?" "I kept thinking this was about revenge," Maya mused, organizing her spice collection while her mind worked through possibilities. "But it wasn't really about the Hendersons at all. It was about discovering who I could become if I stopped apologizing for taking up space." "Exactly," Eleanor said firmly. "And now you know. The question is what you do with that knowledge." By Tuesday, Maya had made her decisions. She called the medical office to tender her resignation. She called Laurent to discuss a partnership expanding Le Petit Jardin's catering operation. She called the Food Network to explore a show focused on heritage cooking with classical technique. But most importantly, she called her grandmother. "Nai," Maya said when the familiar voice answered. "I need to tell you what happened." The conversation lasted 2 hours. Maya recounted every detail, from potluck humiliation through months of training to the anniversary party triumph and its unexpected aftermath. "So now what, Baobei?" Nai asked when Maya finished. "Now I build something," Maya said, her voice carrying new certainty. "Something that honors our family's cooking traditions while showing that excellence transcends cultural boundaries. I want to create a space where heritage and technique combine to tell stories that change how people think about food." "And the people who tried to make you small?" Maya thought about Richard Henderson's rage, Susan's tentative apology, the mixture of embarrassment and admiration in her neighbors' faces. "They're not my concern anymore. I've proven what I needed to prove, mostly to myself." 3 months later, Maya stood in the kitchen of what would soon become Heritage, her new restaurant in a converted farmhouse not far from Le Petit Jardin. Sunlight streamed through windows that would overlook herb gardens, and the bones of a state-of-the-art kitchen were taking shape. Laurent appeared in the doorway, surveying the space. "The timeline is ambitious. 6 months from concept to opening." "I've learned that ambitious timelines can be motivating," Maya replied, running her hands over the space where her pass would be installed. "Besides, I have excellent teachers." David arrived carrying coffee and architectural plans, followed by Mrs. Kowalski and, surprisingly, Susan Henderson. "Susan," Maya said, genuinely surprised. "I hope you don't mind my coming," Susan said hesitantly. "I wanted to ask if you might consider cooking lessons, private ones. I've been thinking about what you said, about food telling stories, and Realize I've never learned to tell my own. Maya studied Susan's face, seeing genuine hunger for authenticity. I think that could be arranged. Cooking is about courage as much as technique. You'll need both. The phone rang as they finished planning. James Murphy's voice bubbled with excitement. Maya, I just got off the phone with a New York publisher. They want to discuss a cookbook deal, your story, your recipes, the whole journey from that potluck disaster to opening your restaurant. Are you interested? Maya looked around the space that would soon become her professional kitchen, at the people who had become her chosen family, at the future she was building through skill, determination, and courage. Yes, she said simply. I'm very interested. As the sun set over what would soon be Maya's restaurant, she stood alone in the empty kitchen space, imagining the sounds and smells that would soon fill it. The woman who had fled the neighborhood potluck in humiliation no longer existed. In her place stood Maya Chen, chef and restaurateur, someone who had learned that belonging wasn't something you earned from others. It was something you claimed for yourself through excellence, authenticity, and the courage to take up exactly as much space as your talents deserved. Maya Chen had finally found her place in Grand Rapids, not by fitting into spaces others had created for her, but by building her own. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't. Want to pass these up? Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.